that, I'd like to introduce our introducer of our speaker, which is Randy Newham. And Randy is professor of political science at Penn State Burbs. Randy, if you'd come up, we'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. And are you going to want a minute at the end to do upcoming events too?
We'll do that at the end.
So
Yep.
we'll do that at the end.
Yep.
Very good. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good to see a good group here. And welcome so much, Ambassador Sullivan. So as you know, we're going to be talking about Putin's war against the West. And we have someone here who has experienced that firsthand. I saw a couple of folks in the audience with a copy of his book, Midnight in Moscow, which I also read before this. And it's too bad you're not here personally. We could get some autographs. But thanks very much for agreeing to join us today. So to introduce Ambassador Sullivan, I have a real proper introduction here because he has a lot of qualifications. So it's very impressive. Ambassador John J. Sullivan, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and former U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation, was recently named as a Distinguished Senior Fellow in Columbia Law School's National Security Law Program. He's also a partner in Meyer Brown's Washington, D.C. and New York offices and co-leads the firm's national security practice. The ambassador's career spans 4 decades in public service, in prominent diplomatic and legal positions under 5 U.S. presidents, 2 Democrats and 3 Republicans. His earlier positions included Deputy Secretary of Commerce under President George W. Bush, following his service from 2005 to 2007 as the General Counsel of the department. In President Bush's first term, he served as Deputy General Counsel of the Defense Department, and in the administration of George H.W. Bush, Ambassador Sullivan was counselor to the Assistant Attorney General J. Michael Luttig in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. In private practice at Meyer Brown, which he first joined in 1993, Ambassador Sullivan has been a member of the Supreme Court and appellate practice and was a co-founder of the National Security Practice. He received his bachelor's degree from Brown University and law degree from Columbia University School of Law, where he was book reviews editor of the Columbia Law Review. And he was also a law clerk for Associate Justice David Souter of the Supreme Court of the United States, and for Judge John Minor Wisdom of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. His many professional honors include the Distinguished Alumnus Award from Columbia Law School's DC Alumni Association. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome John Sullivan. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Randy, for that kind introduction. It's great to be with all of you. Can you hear me all right, Mike?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Good. All right. Well, I've spent many a happy day in and around Reading, in environs, York, Hershey. All my kids played youth hockey. Long trips up to the area to play youth hockey teams. So I am sorry that I can't be with you there and commiserate. I'm sure you're starting to get over the loss by the Eagles on this past Sunday. I learned that I need to pay attention to these types of things when, in promoting my book, my first in-person book event was in College Station, Texas, 2 days after Texas had lost to, Texas A&M had lost to Notre Dame. And it was a funereal atmosphere. It was as if it was a wake. Those poor people down there, this is last season at College Station, hadn't recovered. But I think things are still looking good for your Eagles. What I thought I'd do, we've got a little over, and probably got an hour and 15 minutes or so max. I thought I'd speak for about 30 minutes or so and give you my perspective on Putin, his war. It's not just his war against Ukraine, it's really his war against the West. And I'll start by giving you some context. I went to Moscow as President Trump's ambassador. I was confirmed by the Senate and appointed in December of 2019. For the 3 prior years, I had been the Deputy Secretary of State. and had a lot of engagement with Russia and Russian government officials. I'd met Putin. I had a fairly sophisticated assessment of that the Russian Federation wasn't just a competitor, but was an adversary of the United States. I'll give you my bottom line up front, the so-called bluff, for those of you who have worked at the Pentagon. Putin isn't an adversary of the United States. He is a self-described enemy of the United States. That is how he approaches us. That's how he thinks of us. And I'll try to use the next 30 minutes or so to explain why I believe that, why my view shifted over time, and why I would presume I did not go to Moscow as an expert on Russia. I don't have a graduate degree in Russian studies, Russian language, etc. As I've described in my book, I'm an amateur Russophile. I did want to serve there. I wanted to live there. I enjoyed living there. And I enjoyed the challenge of engaging with the Russian government. But I learned a lot and saw a lot in those 3 years I was there. And my education really accelerated in part because of the pandemic. Now, let me explain why. I show up in Moscow. I'm there at the beginning of January of 2020, a significant moment for those of you who follow Russian affairs. It was the month that Putin announced changes to the Russian constitution, which would allow him to, which would amend the Russian constitution's term limits, allow him to serve until 2036 if he so chose, and the good Lord gave him that time on earth. A number of other amendments to the Russian constitution, a change in prime minister. It was a big political month for Russia, but it was the last month or two before the pandemic really shut down Moscow. And the effect it had on me was it cleared my calendar. So I had no meetings, either public or private, with Russian government officials. All of our business was done virtually by phone or by fax. Believe it or not, we have some agreements executed in the last century which provide for notice or submission of documents by facsimile. And if they're particularly annoyed with us or want to be cantankerous, they will insist that we dust off the fax machines and send them a fax when we want to deliver a document. But it meant I had time on my hands. And how did I use that time? I basically lived in the station. Now, the station is the physical presence declared to the Russians of the Central Intelligence Agency. The chief of the station is publicly identified to the Russians as a senior CIA officer. And the station chief, when I was there, was a terrific guy, one of the best. He's since retired, now teaches at Harvard, but one of the best we have at the agency. Fluent in Russian. Give you a sense of his background. This was, I consider him, I call him my professor. He had served previously as our station chief in Beijing, and before that in Amman. He's fluent in Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian. The first language he learned after English was Russian. And to give you a sense of how smart this guy is, as we say, I'm a native Bostonian, as we say in Boston. This guy's wicked smart. He learned Mandarin at Moscow State University in the 1990s in a class of Russian students from a Russian professor in Russian. That's how he learned Mandarin. Think about that. It's not easy to learn Mandarin in English, let alone in Russian in Moscow. He took me under his wing. I was educated by our intelligence community. I just immersed myself in all that the U.S. government knows about Putin, about Russia, every day, virtually all day long. We had one rule on Sundays, during the fall at least, when the NFL was still playing. We had to finish whatever we were doing by 8 p.m., given the 7-hour time difference, so we'd be back in our residences for kickoff at 1 p.m. Eastern. But I was immersed. I got a graduate degree in Putin and the Russian Federation from all that the United States government has learned about him, about his predecessors, about his government, about the Soviet Union. And I took that class for 13 months. I was stuck in Moscow during the pandemic for 13 months, couldn't travel, was separated from my family. So although I wasn't traveling around the Russian Federation, which was a significant loss for me, I had a plan to travel across Russia. I tried to use my time wisely. I had a number of meetings with Putin himself, and of course got to know the senior government officials there. And my charge as President Trump's ambassador was to stabilize the relationship, work with the Russians in those areas where we could, whether it was cooperation between NASA and the Russian space agency, Roscosmos, arms control discussions, cyber issues, you name it. Ukraine wasn't a high priority for the United States. It cast a pall over the relationship and was always lurking as a giant problem, but it wasn't at the forefront of American diplomacy. I was asked to remain as ambassador when President Biden took office on January 20th, 2021. And my priorities as ambassador, believe it or not, didn't really change that much. Some of the processes changed. I had a lot more interaction with the White House in the Biden administration and with President Biden himself than I had in the Trump administration. In the Trump administration, I had served as Mike Pompeo's deputy, the Secretary of State's deputy secretary. I spoke with him all the time. He was my link back to Washington. I was instructed by him. I wasn't an unguided missile in Moscow. I was instructed by him, but not by the White House, not by the NSC, really. And I didn't speak to President Trump while I was his ambassador in Moscow. The big change when President Biden took office was I got my instructions from the White House, from the NSC, and from the president directly, less so from the State Department. But the substance of our policy didn't change that much. We were looking to work with the Russians in those areas where we could stop the decline in our relations. There were lots of areas where we had to confront them, whether it was cyber attacks, election interference, the treatment of dissidents, Alexei Navalny, among others. But again, Ukraine, I wasn't getting cables from Washington or instructions from the White House telling me, you've got to go in and raise these points, XYZ points, and move the ball forward to solve the problem in Ukraine. The position of the United States, I would summarize as follows. The French and the German governments during the original invasion of Ukraine and Crimea and the Donbass in 2014-15, the German and French governments had taken the lead, particularly Chancellor Merkel. Those governments, along with the Russians and the Ukrainians, had executed two agreements, the so-called Minsk agreements, interim agreements to try to stop the violence and institute a process that would lead eventually to a more stable peace. It never did. The Minsk agreements, the so-called Minsk process, failed long before I became Deputy Secretary of State. But nonetheless, the position of the United States government, when I would seek instruction from Washington and speak with my Russian counterparts, it was Russia signed the Minsk agreements, implement the Minsk agreements. We in the United States want to be constructive, but we are supporting the French and the Germans who have the lead on this. Let me fast forward to President Biden meeting with President Putin, June 16th, 2021 in Geneva. I was with the president. What did President Biden and President Putin not talk about in Geneva? Ukraine. They talked about everything else you can imagine, whether it was cyber, election interference, climate change, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. They spent more time, the two presidents, talking about Afghanistan than they did about Ukraine. So as I look back now, and look particularly at what the Russians did and said, it's extraordinary to me now, as I look back on it, that Putin, given what happened after June 16th, 2021, Putin had the opportunity to sit across from the president a whole day dedicated to their meeting, to sit across from the president, and he didn't make major points about Ukraine. It was, however, now as I look back, the most important issue for him. And how do I know that? Biden and Putin meet all day. Actually, wasn't it? Because of translation, breaks, et cetera. It's not really, it's all day, but it's not really all day. But it was a significant number of hours together. And they, fleeting references to Ukraine, implement the Minsk agreements, solve this problem. And they had a lot of other things to discuss. Arms control, big issues, to be sure, but not Ukraine. The two presidents had back-to-back press conferences. It wasn't a joint appearance, as we saw in August with Putin and President Trump, it wasn't a press conference because there were no questions, but the two stood on stage together. Biden and Putin, we had decided in advance there wasn't going to be a joint appearance by the two of them. So Putin had a press conference, then Biden went second. And at Putin's press conference, and as I look back, this is significant, I believe. Putin walks into this large auditorium with all these reporters, and the first question he gets is from Russian state media, which means it's Putin asking himself a question. And the question that was asked was, Mr. President, the most important thing to Russia and to Russians is Ukraine. What did you talk to President Biden about? And Putin said, well, there were these fleeting references to the Minsk agreements. President Biden said Ukraine should implement the Minsk agreements, and if they could get, their vassals, that's their word. They love that word. We have vassals in London, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, Kyiv. If they can get their vassals in Kyiv to implement the Minsk agreements, that would be a step forward. But we really didn't spend much time talking about it. But you are right. It is the most important issue for Russia and for Russians. Out of that meeting in Geneva, the United States and Russia implemented a series of dialogues, arms control, cyber issues, climate, preparing for COP26. I hosted former Secretary Kerry, who was President Biden's representative for climate and climate change, for almost a week in Moscow, talking to the Russian government about climate change. This was in July of 2021. Wrongfully detained Americans, a whole series of dialogues, nothing about Ukraine. Finally, I arranged for a meeting at the Kremlin to discuss Ukraine in the middle of October. And we got the same response that we'd gotten before, which is you, the United States, this is from the Russian side, you need to tell your puppets, your vassals in Kyiv, that they need to stop the violence, comply with the Minsk agreements, and we'll move forward. And we, Russia, we're not a party to this. This is an internal Ukrainian conflict. I would point out that Russia had signed the Minsk agreements and was certainly supporting half the conflict, was responsible for the violence in the Donbass. And the Russians would simply say, I was flatly mistaken. I didn't know what I was talking about, that this was an internal Ukrainian dispute that the Ukrainians needed to solve. So there was, and my instruction from Washington, again, was not to put the United States front and center as a party, a country, a government that was going to lead all sides to a solution. No, it was this is our message, my message. You need to work with the French and the Germans and the Ukrainians, consistent with the documents that you signed, the Minsk agreements that Russia signed, and move peace forward. And that was the way things stood toward the end of October of 2021. And everything changed at the end of October, right before Halloween. The U.S. intelligence community, which can't reach, it's very difficult for them to reach consensus on anything. And there was consensus reached. Oh, and the work had been going on late summer into the early fall, and it was finally presented to the president. I happened to be home in Washington. I was with Secretary Blinken. To the secretary, the conclusion was unanimous with a relatively high confidence that the massing of troops by the Russians in and around, around Ukraine, in Crimea, in southwestern Russia, working out of Rostov, that the Russians were preparing to invade on a wide scale Ukraine. And that was the assessment of the intelligence community starting at the end of October through February 24th, 2022, when the so-called special military operation began. It was a bit of a shock in Washington. We had seen troop buildups in the region before. There had been exercises before, including in the spring of 2021, and there was speculation that Putin would invade, and he didn't do it. But now the consensus was, given what they were doing logistically, they were doing things that no government, no military would do unless they were actually going to invade. Fuel depots, ammunition depots, field hospitals, bridges near the border that needed to be repaired for armored vehicles to cross into Ukraine, etc., that Russia hadn't done before, wouldn't do unless it was really going to invade. And we had other indications why. I went with, the president sent Bill Burns, Ambassador Burns, who was then director of CIA, to meet with Putin in Moscow. And because I had been home in Washington, I got to travel with Bill to Moscow. We left on Halloween, and he met in Moscow with senior Russian government officials on November 2nd. Putin was not in Moscow. He was at one of his palaces in Sochi. And so it was a secure video teleconference. And Bill conveyed a message from the President of the United States that we saw what the Russians were planning to do. And they were planning, Bill said, we see you're planning to invade Ukraine. Don't do it. The response, not just from the United States, but from the rest of the world, not just the West, will be devastating to Russia. It will be nothing like what happened in 2014-15, particularly on the scale that we believe you're planning to invade Ukraine, so don't do it. The response from the Russians, from Putin on down, was, well, we have no plans. We're not going to invade you. We have no plans to invade Ukraine. We don't, this is wholly made up by you. But if there were a problem in Ukraine, we have rebuilt our military since the demise of the Soviet Union, of the Red Army. We have rebuilt our military, and our military is now very, very capable. We understand that you've imposed economic sanctions, and we understand that you are a much stronger power economically than the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation isn't the Soviet Union. We're not the economic colossus, 350 million people, that the Soviet Union was. We understand that, but don't underestimate our military. So if there's a problem in our neighborhood, we'll handle it, but we're not planning to invade Ukraine. So it was a nuanced message, and what Bill presented to the president was a conclusion that Putin was ready to invade. We didn't know whether he had given the final order or if there was a date set, but our assessment was he was planning to do it. We then had 3 months, November, December, January, and a few weeks into February, over 3 months, of what I call sham diplomacy. Sham because the United States and our NATO allies, we, from the President of the United States on down, Secretary Blinken, myself as ambassador, engaged with the Russian government to try to address concerns they had about NATO and Ukraine, and to see if we could bring them back from the ledge. If there were things that, it was the conversations that if Ukraine had been a priority for the United States in 1920 and the first half of 21, we would have been having then, but we were having them now in December and January, December of 21, January of 22, early February of 22, when the Russians were prepared to invade and had the military wherewithal to do so. We were sincere. I know I was instructed by Washington. There were serious efforts to engage with the Russians, and the Russians were not serious in engaging with us. Why do I say that? I'll give you some examples. The Russians presented to me 2 draft treaties in mid-December of 21. I think it was December 17th. One treaty was between the United States, what purported to be between the United States and Russia. The other purported to be between NATO and Russia. They were flimsy documents, a few pages long. For those of you who are old enough to remember when people used to dictate letters and memos, there would often be a little postscript at the bottom if somebody dictated something and it was transcribed. It would say dictated but not read. It looked dictated but not read for typos. It was just sloppy. And it was in Russian, the 2 treaties, which is not the practice. Our practice is when the United States presents a document to the Russian Federation, we present it in our official language. The official document is in English, but without exception, as a courtesy, we present a Russian translation, and the Russians delight in taking our translation. And, I can't tell you how many meetings I sat to where they take our translated document, not the official version, by the way, but our good faith effort to translate it into Russian, and with red pens, circle our grammatical errors, that sort of thing. They presented me 2 documents in Russian and no copies in English. Okay, why is that a problem? Why? Because they also said, we want to negotiate these 2 documents with the United States in 2 days. This was Wednesday, 2 days, Friday in Geneva. And we will be prepared, we'll be there, ready to negotiate these 2 documents. And I looked at the deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, who had presented them to me. I said, Sergei, it's going to take me time just to get these translated so the president and the secretary of state and the rest of the leaders in Washington can read them. And you want to negotiate these significant issues in now less than 48 hours? That's just not possible. You're not serious. And he said, oh yes, we are. And if you don't come to Geneva, if you don't attend, we'll be there and we'll make these documents public, and it will be an indication publicly that you're not serious about negotiating with us. That's sham diplomacy. And subsequent meetings, I'd go in, I'd talk to my Russian counterpart the way I'm talking to you today. I would be prepared, I'd have points to make, but I wouldn't be reading from a document from my own talking points. I would have that maybe in front of me, often not in my pocket, but I would never read my talking points. I would have absorbed them and put them into my own context, in the context of the meeting and so forth. My Russian interlocutor, and this was across the foreign ministry in the Kremlin, would respond with talking points, and I didn't engage with a single woman diplomat on these issues. They were all men. The men I would engage with read their talking points, and when I would ask a question, and often a question that was related but not directly covered by their talking points, instead of engaging me in a conversation, they would go back through their talking points, flip the pages, and reread the talking point that was closest to the question I raised. That's not a serious give and take. There was no effort to engage. It was all staged. It was all so that the Kremlin could say, we tried. We tried to talk to the United States. We had treaties. We tried to engage them, but they weren't serious. In fact, it was sham diplomacy. And as I write about in my book, it's exactly what the Germans did in 1939 before September 1st. And it was sham diplomacy, creating a crisis, demanding a response. In this case, the Danzig corridor in Poland, creating a crisis, demanding a response by the Poles in 24 hours, in person in Berlin. It's just not serious. It's all for public effect. That's the sham diplomacy that the Russians engaged in for months. We, the United States government, became increasingly confident. We already were confident. We became certain that Putin was going to invade. It was just a question of when. February was a slightly complicated for him because he would have wanted to engage. He would have wanted to invade probably earlier in February of 22, but his dear friend Xi Jinping was hosting the Winter Olympics, and that would have stepped on the pageantry that Beijing wanted the world to focus on. And Putin's relationship with Beijing and the PRC is very important. So he went to Beijing, attended the opening ceremonies, delayed the start of the special military operation until the end of February 24th, but did what I as ambassador was predicting, telling people he was going to invade starting in January. He was going to do it. Interestingly, it was difficult to convince certain audiences who should have known better, in particular, U.S. businesses in Russia, the American Chamber of Commerce in Moscow. When I was ambassador, we had 1,200 U.S. companies doing business invested in Russia. The American Chamber of Commerce in Moscow, the AmCham, had hundreds of members. And starting during the pandemic, I developed a practice of meeting with the AmCham virtually every 2 weeks to address questions, concerns they had. And in the last few months before the war, it was all about what was going to happen with Ukraine. And I would get messages after a town hall from senior American executives, several of whom had lived in Moscow for decades, had Russian spouses, knew Russia, knew Russians, and they told me that I should stop scaring people, that it was irrational. Putin wouldn't invade Ukraine. He was doing everything he could to make it look like he would invade Ukraine so that he could get an advantage on the West in negotiations. And I said, no, he's doing things that he would only do if he were going to invade, and he's going to do it. And many of those people who were skeptical then texted me or called me on their way to the airport on February 25th, 26th, when they were told by their companies that they needed to get out of Moscow, to say, we were wrong. He did it. He did it. He had war aims then. His war aims were, as he described them, to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. And so denazify means remove the government in Kyiv, control Kyiv from Moscow the way Moscow, in effect, controls Belarus. Belarus has a so-called union state with the Russian Federation. There is a president, Lukashenko, of Belarus, but in effect, Russia holds sway over Belarus. And that's what, at a minimum, Putin wants in Ukraine. Denazify, remove the government in Ukraine, which Putin and the Russian pro-war, pro-Z, Z is their symbol for the war, pro-Z Russian nationalists call Ukrainian patriots, Ukrainian Democrats. They're all neo-Nazis, Nazis. So denazify Ukraine, remove the government. Ukraine needs to be controlled by Moscow. And then demilitarize Ukraine, which means take what is now, at least in size, the second largest military in Europe after the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian military is apart from Russia, is the most effective fighting force in Europe by far, outpacing the Germans, the French, and the UK. That military, 1 million plus members, soldiers, sailors, airmen, needs to be reduced to a very small constabulary force, an internal police force, and never join NATO. So demilitarize Ukraine. Those were the war aims that Putin espoused right when the war started, and they haven't changed to this day. Everything I've seen, and I stayed in Moscow through, I retired in October of 22, but I have maintained close watch on what's happened and with colleagues both in the department at the embassy. So I've got a pretty good sense of what's gone on in the last 3 years since I left Moscow. Putin's war aims haven't changed and won't change given the trajectory that the West is on. He will not compromise his war aims. He will not just decide to, he can't do, no matter how effective the Ukrainian opposition has been, military opposition, Putin can't do what Lyndon Johnson did in 1968. He can't and he won't. He can't say, Tet Offensive, well, I won't run for re-election in 68 and I'll just retire to my ranch and the LBJ ranch in Texas and let my hair grow long. Putin won't do that. It's not, it's not in his character, his temperament, his background. And if he did, he wouldn't survive it. So he's not compromising. There is no compromise. And, the President Trump and Special Representative Witkoff have learned that in the first 9 months of this year. President Trump was concerned in the late spring, early summer that Putin was, I think the president's expression was tapping him along. Well, boy, he's tapping like Fred Astaire. He's tapping him along all right, and will continue to do so. He will not compromise. Why? Because this is a matter of fundamental, it's hard to exaggerate, importance to Putin. And Putin's been talking about this war in Ukraine, and it's broader than just Ukraine. But the Ukraine is the current battle space. Putin's been talking about this for decades. We all remember Putin said that the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union. He meant it then, he means it now. And it's fundamentally related to that. It's not the loss of Soviet communism, but Putin is famously said, if you're not nostalgic for how we lived in Soviet times, you don't have a heart. But if you want to return to Soviet communism, you don't have a brain. No, he's not a communist. He's a Russian nationalist, and he's got an imperial ambition for Russia to restore that Russian empire created by the czars who became the emperors of Russia, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and then the Soviet Empire, the USSR, 15 republics, 350 million people. The Russians, complain about Western colonialism, Western imperialism. The biggest empire, the biggest imperial entity was Russia, given the landmass that it conquered, rivaling, the British and the British Empire on which the sun didn't set. So when he says the demise of the Soviet Union was the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, what he's talking about is control over that empire from Moscow. They refer to Moscow as the center. Control from the center. Moscow needs that control. When he was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB in Dresden, as East Germany, as people are, East Germans are starting to surround the Residentura, the KGB station in Dresden. He relates how he famously, it's famously related how he called the Lubyanka, he called the leadership of the KGB to say, what should we do? Should we fire on these people? Should we try to suppress what's happening in East Germany? And what he says happened was no one picked up the phone. So he's on the front lines defending the Russian Empire, and it collapses from within in Moscow because weak-kneed communists like Gorbachev stabbed Russian nationalists, Russian patriots like Putin, Lieutenant Colonel Putin in Dresden, in the back. And the Soviet Union collapsed from within. It's very similar to the argument that Hitler made about the German Empire. And, the Imperial German Army never lost a battle. Not true. But, it was the great stab in the back in Berlin by the communists, the Jews, etc., that caused the German Empire to collapse. It's the same thing Putin thinks about the Russian Empire in the guise of the Soviet Union. So this is his imperial ambition for Russia is real. It's something that goes to his core as a Russian nationalist. He will not compromise. I now have 12:44. I've probably spoken a little longer than I should have, but I want to leave plenty of time for your questions and talk about issues that are of interest to you.
Very good. Thanks very much, Ambassador Sullivan, for a rather sobering talk. I'm seeing some hands up already, so I will be going around and getting some questions for you. And we'll try to keep an eye on time. I guess we have at least 20 minutes or so here to go. So I'll start in the back there. That was the first one I saw.
And are Putin's policies the same as the policies of the Russian government? What I mean is, if Putin were to have a heart attack and die tomorrow,
Yeah.
would the policies continue in his absence through his successors?
I am 100% confident that they would, for the following reasons. It is not, look, Putin, his party, United Russia, when it was founded, the founders, one of the founders, this guy Volodin, who's speaker of the Russian, the Duma, the House of Representatives, famously said, "Putin is Russia, Russia is Putin." But this imperial vision that Putin has, which he's played on Russian historical memory, and their memory of the Russians' memory of the great, what they call the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War. The Ukraine war it's not unpopular in Russia. I'm not saying that, he was reelected last year with, 80+% of the vote. I'm not saying 85 or 87% of the Russian people would have agreed that we should go to war with Ukraine. But having committed the Russian military and Russia's prestige, and what they call their boys, their soldiers on the front lines in Ukraine, the majority of Russians don't want to see their boys slaughtered by incompetent, drunk, corrupt generals who were taking cell phones onto the battlefield as they were, in the first year or so of the war, getting themselves and their troops killed. All the mistakes that they've made. They don't want to see that. So Putin's been very sensitive to that, but they also don't want to see Russia lose. You think about how long it took for popular opinion in the United States to turn against the war in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. Americans don't want to see, at least I remember my memory of the war. I had relatives, a younger cousin who was with the 1st Marine Division at Way City. and on the other side of my family, a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. I was just a kid. I remember thinking, geez, I don't want to see the United States humiliated, defeated in Vietnam. I think the average Russian feels that way as well. They don't want to see Russia lose. So, and Putin plays on this, and what he's done is it's all about historical memory. The defining moment of the Soviet Union, of the Russian people, what they did in history. This is as Putin tells it, defeating, he would say single-handedly, the Germans, the Nazis in World War II. We saved civilization. We're doing the same thing today. This is Putin with the decadent West that is opposed to us and to our values. And it's a neo-Nazi undertaking, and it's an anti-Russia enterprise that's being launched in Ukraine against us. And just as our parents and grandparents resisted, we're doing the same. And yeah, we've lost a lot of men, hundreds of thousands. The Russians won't admit that, but it's pretty widely known. But this is again the Putin, the Kremlin narrative. But that pales in comparison to our losses in the Great Patriotic War. We lost millions to liberate Ukraine. We're doing the same today, fighting the full weight of NATO. So my response to your very good question is this is not just about Putin. Putin has manipulated, has organized the government, has organized the country onto a war footing to fight this war. But he's also done so to prepare the Russian people for losses that they've suffered, not what maybe we in the West would have expected, but economic dislocation and worse to follow maybe in the future. But it's a sacrifice, and he ties it back to what our parents and grandparents sacrificed for in the Great Patriotic War. And that's what we're about. We're saving civilization again, reestablishing the Russian Empire. It was the Soviet Union in 1941, 42, 43 that stood against the Nazi juggernaut, broke its back in Moscow and Stalingrad, and ultimately captured Berlin. We're doing the same. It's not quite the scale of a military conflict, but it is, in his view, a conflict, a war. And that's why I say at the beginning of my remarks, he calls us to a Russian audience, the enemy. And it's not an unpopular view.
Thanks very much. We have a question that's come in on our chat from our web viewers. I think Mike Sutton's going to read that to you.
Yeah, George Ainsworth says, it seems as if the USA has dithered in our support for Ukraine, and asks, do you see any change in what he characterizes as our half-baked support?
Well, there's certainly been a change in the president's rhetoric, in President Trump's rhetoric. He's called the Putin and his press spokesman Peskov. They really didn't like it when the president called Russia a paper tiger. And he's made statements recently about how heroic the Ukrainians have been, how they are resisting this Russian aggression, and they may eventually be able to push the Russians out. So far, it's all, to my knowledge, rhetoric. There's been talk about the United States providing indirectly more advanced Tomahawk cruise missiles to the Russians, which would be capable of strikes deeper inside Russia, which, again, Putin has addressed publicly. He addressed the paper tiger comment, said, nah, we're not a paper tiger. And he's addressed the Tomahawks as well. It would be an escalation, and it would ultimately break relations with the United States. So the rhetoric has improved, but we have to see more practical steps to support the Ukrainians, who have done a remarkable job on behalf of the West, of NATO, in pushing back against this Russian aggression, which, if Ukraine collapses, I don't know any serious person who looks at this and says Putin will stop with Ukraine. One historical analogy which bothers me, just a footnote, as the Germans in the interwar years, particularly in the 30s, as the Nazis, as Hitler was gradually taking more and more aggressive steps, whether it was remilitarizing the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, the Sudeten crisis, etc., the largest army in Europe was the army of the French Republic. Winston Churchill famously said at that time, "Thank God for the French army." But the French were, our divisions today politically are almost pale in comparison to the divisions, or maybe we're getting close, the divisions within France. There was often not a government, functioning government. The French prime minister just resigned a few days ago. There was often not a government in Paris when some of the most aggressive actions that the Germans took in 35, 36, 37, 38, the French were so divided, they were hamstrung. They weren't appeasing. They were on autopilot because they had no government because of their internal divisions. Within France, the right hated the left hated the right, and they hated each other more than they were afraid of, and hated the Nazis. And look where that got them in 1940. I'm not saying that Putin is Hitler. I'm not saying that the Russian Federation is Nazi Germany. But our divisions in the West within the United States, particularly over the threat that Russia poses to us, it's a significant problem.
I'll come up to the front here.
Ambassador Sullivan, it appears to me what you're telling us that our government knew months and months in advance the Russians are serious and they are going to indeed invade Ukraine. Okay, having done that, it seems to me all the reaction to that was in dribs and drabs of sanctions, arms. We're going to give you this, but if you go further, we're going to give you some more, and all that kind of stuff. From my understanding of the history, you don't win wars by doing a dibs and drabs of diplomacy as well as armor. If you were to go back as far as back you want to do, we won wars when finally our politicians decided that we're going to put out full arms and forces behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any logical reason that you can explain to us why Mr. Biden and his staff, and I guess even Mr. Trump, did not follow that philosophy of going with full force to win the war, period, rather than we're going to do this and that?
Yeah, no, listen, it's a criticism of both former presidents, current President Trump and former President Biden that I made in my book. It started, as you note, before the war. I can cite before February 24th. It ultimately stems, and by the way, it's not just the United States. It's the German government, right? The German chancellor, this is to your point, the German chancellor gives a famous speech to the Bundestag. I think it was on February 25th, the day after the special military operation, in which, the famous Zeitenwende speech, in which it's, the German word for, this big shift. Things will never be the same. This history is now changed, et cetera, et cetera. And what is the German government? What is the Ministry of Defense then say it's going to do? It's going to send body armor and helmets and blankets to the Ukrainian military. That continues to this day. To President Trump's credit, to say his criticism of particularly Europeans who continue to buy German oil and gas, continue to fund the Russian war machine. If you mean it, and I think it's true, that Russia is at war with the West, and that battle is being fought in Ukraine, no government in NATO is taking it as seriously as they should. I'll cite an example again. I come back to, instances from World War II, early in World War II, the phony war, right? The Germans invade Poland September 1st, 1939. 2 days later, the British and the French declare war. They're at war with Germany. And then it's not until the spring of 1940 when the Germans invade the Low Countries and France, and then the Battle of Britain. In the lead up to that, and even after the more serious military operations by the Germans began, the Brits are debating among themselves whether the Royal Air Force should bomb defense industrial targets in Germany. This is after the war has started. The response, and the reason that the British didn't, was that we can't bomb Krupp factories. That's private property. You can look it up. Think about that. Think about after the war starts on September 1st, 1939, those in London who were saying, or even we fast forward to 1940, right? We've got to negotiate with the Germans. All wars end in negotiations. It's the same it didn't work in the middle of the 20th century, and it certainly won't work with someone who as dedicated to this war that he started, and he will see it through. He doesn't want the war to end. He wants victory. War is better for him than not victory. And he will continue it until he doesn't think he can achieve victory. And right now, to your point, we in the West, including the United States, are not doing a sufficient job of pressuring him. Now, to get back to the Biden administration, to your question, why the Biden rhetoric, the Biden policy was right. There was real fear from the White House that Putin one of two things would happen, that Putin would strike NATO territory, in which, marshaling areas where equipment and material that were being sent to Ukraine were being marshaled and sent in which case a strike on NATO territory under Article 5, the United States is at war with Russia. Or Putin, if his battlefield losses were serious enough, that he would use a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon. That was a real fear. I thought it was overstated. I think time has proved all the so-called red lines that Putin has uttered. Don't provide this weapon system. That's a game changer. And it's, there have been empty threats. Now, it's easy for me to say I'm not the president of the United States in the Oval Office with ultimate responsibility for defending our country in Reading, Pennsylvania. And the Russian Federation does have the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. But I did not believe that Putin would use a nuclear weapon in or about Ukraine, if only because he would lose the support, as he was told publicly by President Xi, of his most important ally, the People's Republic of China. And there isn't, at least in Ukraine, a battlefield rationale for using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. But it was the threat of an escalation with Russia and the United States getting involved in a shooting war with Russia. Biden's instruction to his government, to his most senior aides, was do everything we can to support Ukraine, but don't get the United States into a war with Russia. And that last caveat was what often influenced policy decisions.
Thank you. Here's another question.
Michael Caterina, you see Putin as the enemy. How does our president and this administration see him?
I would, yeah, that is true. I do see him as the enemy, but that's his word, not mine. I don't believe, and this is back in the Trump 45 administration, so I engaged with the president when I was Deputy Secretary of State on Russia and Russian issues and Putin. It's a very complicated topic because for him, in his mind, because of the 2016 election, Russian election interference. He could never bring himself to acknowledge that the Russians had interfered, disinformation campaigns and so forth, in the 2016 election, because he thought it undermined his legitimacy as president. He thought it meant, and I don't believe this is true, that what the Russians did meant that Trump got elected. So, I don't. I don't think President Trump views the Russians, and Putin in particular, as the president of the Russian Federation, in the same terms that I or a lot of other Americans who have had a deal with his government in the Kremlin do. I think he and others are getting a more accurate assessment over time this year that Putin isn't going to compromise because Trump asked him or Trump induces him, etc. It's just not going to happen. I think our current president underestimates the threat to the West from Russia if we don't confront the Russians in Ukraine, as the Ukrainians are doing now. He's coming more to that view, but it's taken a long time this year, and both our support for Ukraine has waned, and the sanctions on Russia, which need to be updated and tightened. Not just new sanctions, but those sanctions that exist need to be tightened when the Russians find workarounds, including those in snuffing them out. So not a good performance, in my opinion, and not adequate to the task of confronting the real risk to the United States. You want to put America first? America is threatened by Russian aggression. That is a fact. And it is not my fellow Republicans who say, I'm more concerned about the southwestern border of the United States than I am about the borders of Ukraine. You may not like Ukraine. You may not have the same respect I do for their heroism. Trump seems to be changing his tune on that. But you may not give a whit about Ukraine, but you got to care about and be concerned about Russia and their aggression. And look what's happening with, drones in Poland, fighter aircraft breaching Estonian airspace, drones in Romania. This, we have in Moscow, we have the U.S. Embassy. We have a classified book. It's our operating procedures for how we operate the embassy, which is different from how every other U.S. embassy in the world operates because of the threat we face, the counterintelligence threat we face in Moscow, and they're informally known as the Moscow rules. Then there's sort of the accepted wisdom that's passed down from generation to generation of just rules of thumb for being a U.S. diplomat in Russia. And the first rule, at least in my mind, is in Russia, there are no coincidences. Drone incursions into Poland, fighter aircraft breaching NATO airspace in Estonia. There are no coincidences. These aren't accidents. And that threatens the West, which means it threatens us.
Thank you. Okay, Rodney, we'll give you.
Something I think I've heard Putin say on a few occasions is that he views the world as having three great powers, Russia, China, and the US, and that the rest of the planet in many respects should simply be vassals of one of the three.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate statement of what you think he believes?
It's his aspiration. I think he believes it because of his nuclear weapons, which give him his energy. And as Senator McCain, the late Senator McCain famously said, Russia is a matter of interest because it's a big gas station with nuclear weapons. His energy and his nukes, he thinks, gives him that status. I'm not so sure, but that's certainly what he strives for. As far as economic throw weight compared to the United States and the PRC, Russia is a pipsqueak. We've also seen that it's interesting. It's thinking about the Cold War and going back to the Second World War. There's sort of been an inversion. The Russian conventional military back then, the Red Army. If you think about the Cold War and the concern of a conventional war in Europe, it was the fear of the Red Army, the massive Red Army supporting the Warsaw Pact, which we in the West weren't prepared. It was our nuclear weapons, the United States providing that nuclear safeguard. Now we've seen the Russian conventional military revealed. It's large, it's dangerous, but it's not nearly as effective or competent as one would have thought. But they still got that large stockpile of nuclear weapons. So he believes that gives him a claim to be a superpower, and he expects to be treated as such. When the president of the United States calls Russia a paper tiger, when a former president of the United States says, Russia's a regional power, that really offends him. So I think he believes it. I don't think it's true, but I think he believes it. He wants that status, though.
I think we may be up to about our last question, and then we will have, I think, some announcements to close.
Hi, my name's Stephen Yarnell. I want to ask you the million-dollar question. If you were the president of the United States and had access only to what you know now, what would you do about Ukraine and the United States position?
Well, I would not in episodic off-the-cuff statements give remarks that lay out that Russia, the Russian Federation, led by President Putin, has waged an aggressive war, that the UN, the General Assembly, more than 140 countries, this is 3 years ago now, declared unlawful and rebuked Russia. And so that there's no confusion, I would say I may not use the word enemy publicly, or I might, but I would first make sure that the American people understand that Russia considers itself at war with the United States. The average American doesn't think that. And then I would do much more to support Ukraine. And this is where President Trump does deserve credit, try to convince our NATO allies, as we've been trying for the last 11 years since the Wales NATO conference, to do more in their own self-defense. President Trump is absolutely right about that. The fact that a country as large, with an economy as large as it is, Germany, the French, the UK, there are more admirals in the Royal Navy now than there are ships. The Europeans, it's only the United States that really stands in the way of further Russian aggression in Europe. So I would make it clear to Putin that we are opposed to his aggression, and we will do all we can. We are not good. We should not engage in regime change. I would not be about changing. The Russian people have to decide for themselves what their government is, but the Russians don't get to decide who governs Ukraine, and we will do all we can to defend Ukraine. And if that involves, much larger contribution by not just the United States, by the West, of military equipment, including, for example, Tomahawk cruise missiles, for the Ukrainians to defend themselves. And when the Russians complain about it, I'd point out the fact that, the surface-to-air missiles that the North Vietnamese used to defend North Vietnam and shoot down American aircraft were provided by the Soviet Union, were manned by Russians. The fighter aircraft that the North Vietnamese military used, Sukhoi aircraft, many of them flown by Russian pilots. We've done this before. We did it. We were opposed to the Russians in Afghanistan. They were opposed to us in Vietnam. Go back to Korea. This isn't new. But we need to approach this, think through in the context of an aggressive nuclear superpower that's looking to change borders in Europe. And we got to get the thinking in Washington beyond, let's just put a cork in Russia and focus on the real issues which are in the Pacific. The Russians, Putin won't let us do that.
Thanks very much. Appreciate your insights, Ron. All Ambassador.
Thank you.
Now I think we have a couple of final announcements from Lynn Brown. Oh, and by the way, we are sending the ambassador a package, I believe, right?
We are.
You're probably going to mention that since he's not here in person to get our traditional speaker's gift. I don't know. Are we telling him what it is, or is it going to be a surprise? Oh.
Well,
Okay.
Ambassador Sullivan, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. You had me glued to every word you said. So thanks so much. We are sending you a gift from the Pennsylvania Dutch country. It's a plate that is really endemic of our culture in Pennsylvania Dutch culture, and we hope you enjoy it. It's on its way to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.